All right, thank you. Please be seated. Good morning. Welcome back. Hope everyone had a nice cold weekend. It's my understanding you've already ordered lunch on your lunch forms, okay, and they've got drinks and snacks back in the jury room. If at any point during the trial there's anything we can do to make your stay more tolerable, please let us know. From the smallest thing to the biggest thing, nothing's too small if you have a question or a request. Also, if anyone needs a break before our regular breaks, we try to take a break every hour and a half or so, but if anyone needs a break sooner, just let us know. And there's no assigned seating, so y'all are free to stay in that way or move around if you want to. That's up to you. All right, also, can we go ahead and pass the notepads and pencils out, please? I'm going to tell y'all about note-taking during the jury instructions. All right, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this time I'm going to read to you your preliminary instructions. You have been selected and sworn as the jury to try the case of State of Florida versus Donald Wayne Hartung. This is a criminal case. Donald Wayne Hartung is charged with 3 counts of first-degree murder. The definition of the elements of these charges will be explained to you later. It is your solemn responsibility to determine if the state has proved its accusations beyond a reasonable doubt. Your verdict must be based solely on the evidence or lack of evidence and the law. It is the judge's responsibility to decide which laws apply to this case and to explain those laws to you. It is your responsibility to decide what the facts of this case may be and to apply the law to those facts. Before proceeding further, it will be helpful if you understand how a trial is conducted. At the beginning of the trial, the attorneys will have an opportunity, if they wish, to make an opening statement. The opening statement gives the attorneys a chance to tell you what evidence they believe will be presented during the trial. What the lawyers say is not evidence, and you're not to consider it as such. Following the opening statements, witnesses will be called to testify under oath. They will be examined and cross-examined by the attorneys. Documents and other exhibits also may be produced as evidence. After the evidence has been presented, the attorneys will have the opportunity to make their final argument. Following the arguments by the attorneys, I will instruct you on the law applicable to this case. After the instructions are given, you will then retire to consider your verdict. You should not form any definite or fixed opinion on the merits of the case until you have heard all of the evidence, the argument of the lawyers, and the instructions on the law. Until that time, you should not discuss the case among yourselves. During the course of the trial, we will take breaks during which you will be permitted to separate and go about your personal affairs. During these breaks, you're not to discuss the case with anyone, nor permit anyone to say anything to you or in your presence about the case. If anyone attempts to say anything to you or in your presence about the case, tell that person to stop. If they fail to stop, leave at once and let court security know, who will advise me. The case must be tried by you only on the evidence presented during the trial in your presence, in the presence of the defendant, the attorneys, and the judge. Jurors must not conduct any investigation of their own. Until the trial is over, jurors must not have discussions of any sort with friends or family members about the case or the people and places involved. So do not let even the closest family member make comments to you or ask questions about the trial until it's completed. Of course, after that, you'll be free to have all the discussions you wish. In this age of electronic communication, I want to stress that just as you must not talk about this case face to face, you must not talk about this case by using an electronic device. You must not use phones, computers, or other electronic devices to communicate about the case. Do not send or accept any messages related to this case or your jury service. Do not discuss this case or ask for advice by any means at all, including posting information on an internet, website, chat room, or blog. In every criminal proceeding, a defendant has the absolute right to remain silent. At no time is it duty of a defendant to prove his innocence. From the exercise of a defendant's right to remain silent, a jury is not permitted to draw any inference of guilt, and the fact that a defendant did not take the witness stand must not influence your verdict in any manner whatsoever. The attorneys are trained in the rules of evidence and trial procedure. It is their duty to make all objections they feel are proper. When an objection is made, you should not speculate on the reason why it is made. Likewise, when an objection is upheld by me, You must not speculate on what might have occurred had the objection not been upheld, nor what a witness might have said had the witness been permitted to answer. You've been given notepads and pencils. If you would like to take notes during the trial, you may do so. On the other hand, you are not required to take notes if you do not want to. That is left up to you individually. Any notes that you take will be for your personal use. However, you should not take them with you from the courtroom. During breaks, the deputy will take possession of your notes and return them to you when we reconvene. You will have your notes available in deliberation. After you've completed your deliberations, the deputy will deliver your notes to me. They will be destroyed. No one will ever read your notes. If you do take notes, do not get so involved in note-taking that you become distracted from the proceedings. Your notes should be used only as aids to your memory. Whether or not you take notes, you should rely on your memory of the evidence, and you should not be unduly influenced by the notes of other jurors. Notes are not entitled to any greater weight than each juror's memory of the evidence. All right, as I said, the attorneys will now have an opportunity to make the opening statement. What the attorneys say is not evidence, and you're not to consider it as such, but please give them your attention. Ms. Jensen?
Thank you, Your Honor. May it please the court.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back. Voncile Smith, Richard Smith, and John Smith. Those are the three people that were killed in this case, and they are the mother and the two half-brothers of this defendant, Donald Hartung. The three of them, Voncile, Richard, and John, all lived together in their home on Deerfield Drive. And on Tuesday, July 28th of 2015, you will see that this family was brutally and violently murdered by this defendant. The evidence will show that Donald Hartung beat John in the head with a hammer and slit his throat. The evidence will show that this defendant beat his mother in the head with a hammer and slit her throat. And the evidence will show that when Richard came home from work on that Tuesday, this defendant shot Richard in the side of the head and slit his throat, just as he did his mother and John. And the evidence will show, ladies and gentlemen, that he did it all for their money. You will see the last will and testament of Voncile Smith. His mother left everything to his two brothers, John and Richard. She specifically excluded him from her will. And what you will see during the course of this trial through evidence is that for him to get anything, they all three had to die. On Tuesday, July 28th of 2015, this defendant had the motive and this defendant had the opportunity. So let's talk about the Smith family. The mother, Voncile Smith, liked to go by the name Bonnie. She was 78 years old at the time of her death, and she spent the vast majority of her time at home, sitting in her recliner in the living room, watching TV and ordering QVC. Her husband of 47 years passed away in 2012, and so she lived at home with her two sons, Richard and John. Richard, who sometimes was referred to as RT, his middle name's Thomas, so Richard Thomas, RT. He was 49 years old at the time of his death. He worked as a computer specialist or an IT computer type person for the Department of Homeland Security. He had been doing that work with DHS for a number of years, with DHS and other agencies. Richard was not married, and he had no children. And you will hear that he basically worked, and then he went home and he took care of his mother and his brother, John. John was 47 years old at the time of his death, and you will hear that he functioned a little slower than most people from an issue at birth. John worked as a cart pusher for Walmart at the location on Mobile Highway, and he worked there since the store was opened for over 20 years. John was not married, and he also had no children. You are going to hear from Deerfield Drive neighbors that Bonnie, Richard, and John were not very social. They pretty much stayed to themselves. You will hear from one neighbor that he never even saw Bonnie in the entire time that he lived next door for some years. John and Richard both worked 5 days a week, so they pretty much went to work and they came home. But basically the point is that this family really just kind of kept to themselves. Excuse me, I'm technologically challenged. If it was one button, I might have been able to do it. This is just an aerial of the Deerfield Drive neighborhood. And what you will see is this is Klondike Road, and then here is the entrance to Deerfield Drive. The neighborhood is rectangular, and basically when you come off of Klondike, you can either go straight and then come around this bend, and the Smith home was right where this red arrow thing is, or you could come in off of Klondike, take a left, go around, and then get to the Smith house. There was a neighbor, if you're facing the Smith residence, if you're facing it, if you look to your left, there was a neighbor on the left, and then there was a neighbor closer on the right. This is just a picture to show you the front of the Smith residence.
Judge, may we approach for a moment?
Yes.
I'm sorry, Mr. Johnson.
As I was saying, this is just a picture of the front of the Smith residence on Deerfield Drive. This is a picture of the cars. This is a Toyota RAV4 that Bonnie typically drove. This is a white Toyota Highlander that Richard drove. John did not drive. So now let's talk about this defendant. This defendant, Donald Wayne Hartung, was 58 years old at the time of the murders. He did not live with the Smith family at the family home. He lived by himself a few miles away in a small, modest, two-bedroom home that he had been renting for years. This is a photo of Mr. Hartung's home at the time. He also drove an older, I believe it's a 1989 Lincoln Town Car. The defendant worked as a security guard at Sacred Heart Hospital, making approximately $10 an hour. He was not married. He had been divorced for some time. He has a son who lives in Virginia, but at the time of these murders, they were not very close. As a routine, this defendant went to the Smith home on Tuesdays and cooked dinner. The defendant was off on Tuesday, John was off on Tuesday, and Bonnie was always home. So this defendant would go there on Tuesdays and cook. Richard worked Monday through Friday, and so the defendant would leave Richard's food in the oven for Richard to eat whenever he got home from work on Tuesdays. Also, as a routine, when this defendant went to the Smith family home on Tuesdays, he would take his dog. He had a boxer, and the Smiths had a large backyard with a chain link fence. So this defendant would bring his dog and let his dog run around the backyard. This back door right here is, you will hear testimony that that's the door that the Smith family used when coming and going. So that's general information about the Smiths, general information about the defendant, and general information about his routine on Tuesdays. Specifically, on Tuesday, July 28th of 2015, this defendant went to the Smith home and cooked dinner. And that Tuesday, July 28th of 2015, is the last day the Smith family is known to be alive, and this defendant was the last person known to be with them. The defendant went over there that Tuesday. He cooked fried chicken, frozen corn, frozen green beans, French fries, and biscuits. Richard's was left in the oven. And the evidence is going to show, ladies and gentlemen, that after they ate, John went into the den area, which is where he normally sat and watched TV. And while he was sitting on a love seat in the den, this defendant went into the den and beat John in the head with a hammer and slashed his throat. You are going to see blood, hair, spatter on some boxes and some things behind where John was sitting, and it just shows that that's where he was sitting at the time that he was murdered, and it was also the same place he was sitting when law enforcement found him. As this defendant's mother, Bonnie, sat in her recliner in the living room where she normally sat and watched TV and ordered QVC, this defendant beat his mother in the head with a hammer. He slit her throat, and the medical examiner, excuse me, will tell you that Bonnie was hit in the head approximately 8 times. Excuse me. And then this defendant waited for Richard to get home. And what the evidence will show is that he cleaned up blood, he cleaned up food from the food that had been cooked, and he also took blankets and clothes, and he piled them on top of John's body in the den. He moved his mother's body from the recliner in the living room to John's room down the hallway. And then he covered his mother with clothing and blankets, just as he had done to John. He also took rugs. There you'll see these bloody kind of drag marks from the living room area down the hallway to John's room. There are blood that looks like it's been dragged. And he also took rugs and placed them over the top of these drag marks. And then he waited for an unsuspecting Richard to come home. When Richard came home from work that day, which the evidence will show was approximately 7 p.m., we know Richard left work about 6:36. But when Richard got home that day, he went into the den, and while he was in the den, this defendant shot Richard in the right ear. Now, it did not end up being a very good shot. You will hear from the medical examiner that it did not do any major damage to Richard, but it was obviously strong enough and startling enough to stun somebody. Ultimately, this defendant slit Richard's throat, just as he had done to John and his mother. Richard's body came to rest on the floor in the den area, right in front of where John was seated on the love seat in the den. And then this defendant placed blankets and clothing and items on top of Richard's body, just as he had done to John and his mother. You will hear from a neighbor next door to the Smith family, and he is going to tell you that he saw this defendant leave the Smith house that day around twilight, and he will describe for you what that means. You know, in the middle of summer, this was in July, it stays lighter late. And you will hear that sunset, not sundown, sunset on Tuesday, July 28th of 2015 was 7:46 p.m. It will be clear to you that this family was killed on that Tuesday, July 28th. John had a doctor's appointment the next day, Wednesday the 29th at 10:20 a.m. He never showed. Richard was scheduled to be off that Wednesday to take John to the appointment that John never showed for. But Richard also never responded to text messages. He has a friend and a coworker named Tammy Duncan, and she would text him on a regular basis, and she texted him that Wednesday, and he never responded. Richard also never showed up for work on Thursday or Friday. When Richard's body was found, you are going to see that he was in the exact same clothing that he was wearing on Tuesday, July 28th, when we know he left work. This is a photograph of Richard. This is a photograph, a still shot of the video you will see showing him leave his place of employment on July 28th at approximately 6:36 p.m. It will be clear to you through the evidence in this case that this family was murdered that Tuesday while this defendant was there cooking their last meal. By Friday, July 31st, this is 3 days after the victims are last known to be alive, and this defendant is the last person known to be with them. Richard's supervisor was obviously concerned that Richard had not shown up for work. So Friday morning, Richard's supervisor drove out to the Smith family home. And when he got there, Richard's car was in the driveway. So he went and knocked on the doors, rang the doorbells, tried to get someone's attention. He noticed that there were some packages on the front porch. No one ever answered. He ended up calling the sheriff's office. Sheriff's office came out to do a welfare check. Deputies responded to the house. They walked around the area. They will tell you that there were no signs of forced entry. No broken windows, no kicked in doors, nothing to indicate that someone had broken in to this home. As a matter of fact, they ended up using a credit card to pick the back lock on the back door. Deputies end up going inside, and you are going to see pictures that crime scene personnel took once they arrived and went inside the home. And the deputies will tell you that when they first went inside the house, nothing they saw appeared obvious that 3 people had been murdered in this home. Now you are going to see that there were piles of stuff everywhere. Bonnie had a QVC addiction of sorts. There was stuff everywhere, clothes, trinkets, all kind of stuff. So when the deputies first went inside, it was difficult to really see that anything was kind of amiss. I think some people may describe this as kind of like a hoarding house type. Stuff everywhere is my point. But while deputies were in the den area, they kind of looked at the pile of stuff that was on the floor in the den, and they lifted up an edge of this pile, and they noticed that there was a white shoe. They also noticed that there was a pile of similar blankets and clothing, what have you, that was on the love seat, and then ultimately they realized that there was another body there. They then went down the hallway into the room on the right, which is we now know is John's room, and there was a similar pile, as the ones that were in the den, piled up pretty high, and when they lifted another part of that pile, they noticed a hand, and we now know that ended up being Bonnie. Crime scene personnel did a sketch in this case, and I'm going to show it to you just to kind of orient you, give you an idea of the layout of the Smith family home. So this front up here is going to be Deerfield Drive. This will be the front door. The cars were parked over here. This is in the driveway, and then if you come through this gate, this is going to be the back door. When I showed you that photo of the backyard where it's fenced in, this is the door that the Smith family typically used. And when you go inside, you immediately are in a laundry room type area. There's a small half bath to the left. The kitchen is to the right, and straight ahead is this den area that we're calling it. Richard's body was found laying on the floor. John's body was found on this love seat. When you go through the kitchen, you immediately go to this dining area, and then here's the family room. You will see this chair, which is the chair we believe that Bonnie typically sat in. There was a TV up against this wall. And then there's a formal dining room area and a formal living room area. Again, just kind of chock full of stuff. Here's the front door. And then down this hallway, the first bedroom on the left is going to be Richard's room. First doorway on the right is going to be John's room, which is where Bonnie was found. And then if you get on the hallway a little further, there's a bathroom, and then there's Bonnie's room, and she had an attached bathroom. You will see the drag marks that I was talking about earlier from this family room area. They kind of go down the hallway leading to John's room, but they're covered up by rugs. So once the initial responding deputies find these bodies, and they don't uncover them, all they do is see the shoe, they see the hand, and they get out of there, okay? They, at that point, call homicide investigators, crime scene personnel. All those people start responding and doing their investigation. This defendant was interviewed the day that the bodies were found, about 2 hours afterward, and he denied doing anything to his family. He admitted being there on that Tuesday and cooking. And you'll see and hear his full interview. He was interviewed again about 12 hours later on August 1st, because by that time investigators they knew a little bit more about what had happened. The bodies had been uncovered, the medical examiners had come. But again, this defendant denied doing anything to his family. But what he did say was that he never saw Richard on that Tuesday, July 28th. Never saw Richard, and that he never touched anything of Richard's. And then the forensics started coming back in this case. Richard carried a fabric Swiss Army type case, and in it he kept his checkbook, his bills, financial statements, things of that nature. It was found on the kitchen counter by the sink with Richard's blood. But what was also on it was this defendant's DNA. And his DNA was not only on the fabric case itself, but it was on Richard's checkbook inside the fabric case. There was also a trash can in the kitchen, and you'll see pictures of it. It appeared to be evidence of cleanup from the food and from the murders. There were miscellaneous things in there. There was a broken duck figurine. There was 2 of Bonnie's purses, her wallet. There was food. You'll see a number of things from this cleanup. But smack dab in the middle of these things that had been cleaned up was a cigarette butt that had this defendant's DNA on it. There was a hammer found next to the sink in the kitchen. Maybe washed or cleaned. It didn't have obvious amounts of blood on it, but it had this defendant's DNA as well as Bonnie, Richard, and John. But not only that, it tested positive in different areas for the presence of blood. You will see that Richard's body looked like it had been moved. You will see in the photographs, once they're admitted into evidence, that there's some blood kind of pooling right here, also on the back of Richard. So it looks like possibly he had been on his back at some point, and you'll see that his foot is kind of contorted. Also is his back, or excuse me, is his belt, which looks like it has either been lifted or pulled. That belt was sent to a lab for DNA testing. This defendant's DNA is on the inside of Richard's belt. Again, he told law enforcement that he had not seen Richard on the 28th and never touched anything of Richard's. This defendant also told law enforcement that he left the Smith home that day around 5:30 or 6. And again, you will hear from the neighbor that will say it was later than that. It was somewhere closer to twilight. But what that neighbor is also going to tell you is that Richard came home while the defendant was still at the Smith home. The neighbor will tell you the sequence was this. Donald Hartung went to the Smith home that afternoon. Richard came home while the defendant was still there, and then a short time later, this defendant left, again around twilight. Ladies and gentlemen, not only will there be no question that these murders happened on July 28th, but there will be no question that this defendant is the person who murdered his family. And here is why. Last will and testament of Voncile Smith. You will see a certified copy that will be moved into evidence. Regarding Voncile's estate, I hereby give, devise, and bequeath to my husband, Richard A. Smith, provided he shall survive me. But if he does not survive me, then an equal share to my 2 sons, Richard Thomas Smith and John William Smith, to be theirs absolutely. I have intentionally made no provision herein for the benefit of my son, Donald Wayne Hartung, Jr., not for lack of love or affection, but because he has sufficient assets of his own, and I have made ample provisions for him during my lifetime. Signed, Voncile Smith. He was excluded. So to be included, all 3 of them had to die. Thank you so much for your time and your attention during the course of this trial.
Yes.